Glad to see you all. I did put together sort of some notes about this because I would like to keep it a little bit coherent. I have been teaching the topic for a long time, but I thought I'd start with some things about the history of voting in the United States. And one of the things that's so interesting about this, one of the questions I ask the kids is if they ever had a time when they were children and you're playing together and you have a difference of opinion about what you want to do next and you can't resolve it. So what do? Take a vote. It's something that Americans are socialized to do from a very early age. This is how we solve things. We take a vote. So how far back does that go? Well, in the case of the white Europeans who founded our political institutions in this country, it goes all the way back to the beginning. The first record that I can find of a government in America that used voting as a method of decision making was in Plymouth Colony. The history behind that is interesting. The Pilgrims, of course, were ordinary people. They were not as wealthy and powerful and, be it said, as politically obstreperous as their successors, the Puritans. These were very, very ordinary people. And they understood, I mean, sometimes comedians crack jokes about this, but the Pilgrims understood that they'd been blown off course and they weren't in Virginia when they got to the New World. And one of the things that meant was that the documents that they had with them about how they were going to run the colony, they didn't know if any of that was enforceable because they weren't in Virginia. They were in a different place. So before they got off the boat, they sat down and they wrote a brief compact about how they were going to run things. It's the first American Constitution. It's the Mayflower Compact, and it's only about half a page. But one of the things in it is that decisions would be taken by voting by majority vote. That's how far back it goes as a sense of American government, that we take a vote, that's how we make decisions. If we fast forward to the 1750s and the growing dispute between the American colonists and their British overlords, one of the big issues was about voting, because the Americans wanted representation in Parliament. You know the old phrase, no taxation without representation. What the British said was, don't be ridiculous. You are Englishmen and therefore you are represented in Parliament. This is called virtual representation. Interestingly enough, American slaveholders used the same argument when they were writing the Constitution in 1787. But in the 1750s, the Americans were having none of it. If it's not actual voting, it's not representation. None of this virtual representation stuff. This is not good enough. And it explains the provisions in Article 1 of the Constitution, which are such a pain in the butt to the people in Congress. You have to live in the district you represent. That goes all the way back to the pre-revolutionary era and the fact that Americans would not have themselves represented by somebody on the other side of the ocean who did not know anything about their problems. And you find the same sensibility in the United States today. This is why congressmen have to have two homes, one in the district and one in Washington. Yeah. Property qualifications were initially common in the U.S. You had to own a certain amount of property in order to be eligible to vote, but those disappeared actually pretty quickly. It was very interesting. There were some places, Rhode Island being one of them, in the infant United States, where you didn't have to own property in order to be a voter, in order to have the right to vote. And of course, the election of 1824 was the first one with what we describe as universal white manhood suffrage. Any white man who was over a certain age was eligible to vote, even if he didn't own any property. And that was the case nationwide. That was where we got Andrew Jackson into the White House, because those people were really important in voting for him. So property qualifications went bye-bye in the United States in the early part of the 19th century. They continued in Britain almost until the dawn of the 20th century, for a very long time, but not in the US. Property qualifications were not necessary. This was one of those waves of democratic fervor, and it knocked down property qualifications. Martin Luther King Jr. once said that the arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And I like to think that you can see that if you look at the amendments to the US Constitution. And voting is one of the places where you can see that. At first you have, and please remember, there is one thing that is extremely peculiar about the US Constitution. Federalism in the United States is more powerful, I would say, than it is in any other comparable advanced Western democracy. The state and local governments do things in the US that you don't do at the provincial level in a place like France or Germany. I mean, it's one of the assignments that I have the kids do is to attend a meeting of local government. And one of the things that they comment on when they've done that is, wow, they had no idea the size of the decisions that are made by, like, their neighbors down the block, and the people. One of the best reports I ever had on that was some years back. A young man went to a meeting in Riverside, and he lived in Riverside. It was the Riverside Park District. And he said, they were talking about spending $10,000 to renovate the soccer fields. He said, I played on those soccer fields when I was a child, and it never occurred to me how much it cost to keep them up. Those kinds of decisions at the local level. So one of the things you have to remember about voting in the United States is that for the most part, it is a state and local matter. In Article 1, it's very peculiar because we have this national government. We have the House of Representatives and the Senate. But who determines the voting qualifications and the manner of voting for the House of Representatives? It's the states. It's the states. This is why it varies. It's not unconstitutional for it to be different, with a few exceptions. And this is what gets back to King's comment. Because initially you have white men voting. Then with the 15th Amendment, you have voting rights for black men. The 19th Amendment gave the vote to women. The 26th Amendment gave the vote to 18-year-olds. And one of the things I point out to my students is, if you look at the dates for proposal and ratification of the 26th Amendment, it was the shortest time that it took to ratify a constitutional amendment in American history, and boy was it short. It was about 3 months. And the reason why, of course, was if you look at the date. It was the 1970s, the war in Vietnam. And I remember the discussion about this. Old enough to fight, old enough to vote. And these are the few parameters, with one more, which is that you can't impose poll taxes. It's the only time that primaries are mentioned in the US Constitution. It's in the amendment that prohibits poll taxes. That's all the Constitution has to say about voting. Not very much. Not really very much. It does suggest that you can see in the Constitution what King was talking about, as the tendency has been to expand voting rights and increase the number of Americans who can cast a ballot. Voting is a state and local function. It is not a national function. Part of what this means is, and I tell the kids and I tell their parents on mini class night, the American governmental system is most complex in the world. This is not an idle boast, it's a mathematical fact. Because the holy grail of American political science is a mathematical formula that will accurately predict the results of the next presidential election. People have been working on it for several generations, and the mathematical models they have come up with would cover the walls here, and they still haven't got it. And it's unlikely they're going to get it, because I asked the kids, how do you make an equation harder to solve? You add more variables. That's what the American system does. It distributes political power. The founders were paranoid about power. They were scared to death of it. They didn't want to concentrate it in any one place, so they spread it out all over everywhere. And there is a whole bunch of stuff that is given to the state governments. Remember, the 9th and 10th Amendments the 9th Amendment says this is not a complete listing of all of the people's rights, and the 10th Amendment says any power left lying around goes to the states and to the people. It does not go to the central government. That's basically what the 10th Amendment says. And so there's an awful lot in the hands of the state and local governments, which is why we have the term in this country, voter burden. Voter burden. There is just an awful lot of stuff that the government asks your opinion about. If we were French or German, nobody would be asking us to decide how much money we want to spend for a swimming pool at Oak Park River Forest High School and how big it should be. But this has been a matter of at least 2 election cycles in Oak Park that I can recall. And I always like to use that example because I have Fenwick swimmers in my classes. And if you mention, how many of you guys have ever been in the pool at OPRF? And of course, all of the swimmers' hands go up because they've been to swim meets at OPRF. And the girls have the funniest look on their faces. It's all, yeah, I've been in that pool. And then I say to them, I hate to tell you this, but I don't think they've remodeled it since I was in it. And that was a very long time ago. It does illustrate the importance of voting, however, because in a town of, what is Oak Park, 140,000? 150,000. Yeah. Mm-hmm. The first referendum for the swimming pool failed by, I think it was 257 votes. It's a ridiculously small number of votes. A ridiculously small number of votes. So, yeah, voter burden, they're going to ask your opinion about all kinds of things. There are different kinds of referenda. The state of Illinois has referendum, and it has a couple of kinds. There are advisory referenda, when they ask the people, what do you think about this? What would you like the state government to take up? And then there is a binding referendum. I like that example, having grown up in Oak Park, because that's how Oak Park funds the schools. The village of Oak Park, through much of my life in the village of Oak Park, referenda for the schools are almost never defeated, despite the fact that if the villagers in Oak Park vote yes on a binding referendum for the schools, their taxes go up immediately. There is no other level of government that has to weigh in. When the voters say, we're going to raise taxes in a binding referendum for the schools, that doesn't go to the village board. It doesn't go to the village manager. It doesn't go to anybody. The voters have said, the taxes go up. That's what a binding referendum is. Interestingly enough, turnout isn't always huge. Turnout isn't always huge, partly because you have so many decisions to make. There's been a lot of conversation lately about the mechanics of elections. I was an election judge for many years. I've thought about doing it again. I've decided I don't want to do it because I feel, and the other AP Gov teachers from other schools that I talk to are pretty much in agreement with me. Our place on election day is in school with our students. So although I am never going to vote early again as long as I live in Oak Park, because Oak Parkers vote early. And I learned my lesson in 2020 and 2022. It was ridiculous. Now, admittedly, 2022 was a midterm election and not as big a turnout, and 2020 was huge, as we all remember. But in 2020, I decided, for some reason, to vote early. So I went down to Village Hall a few days before the election. I was in line for almost 2 hours. The cool thing about being in line to vote is that you meet really cool people when you're in line to vote. You meet very interesting people. And I got into several really nice, interesting conversations. I also had time to read an entire article in Foreign Affairs. However, I observed quite a few interesting things about it. Oak Park, of course, had a drop box. It was a beautiful day in the fall, and I was down at Village Hall where there's, that courtyard in the middle. And there was a drop box in the middle of the courtyard, and during those hours, the Village of Oak Park had an election judge posted at the drop box. So when people came in with their mail-in ballot envelope, the judge would take a look at it and tell them if there was something wrong with what they'd written on the outside. In other words, you wouldn't need to cure a ballot like that because it would be, if you didn't mix up the date of the election and your birthday, for example. That apparently is something that happens sometimes. Or you forgot to sign it. The judge would point that out to you so you could fix it right now before it goes in the box, and your ballot will be counted. In 2022, having sworn I would not vote early again, my sister wasn't kidding, Oak Parkers vote early. I voted on election day. My polling place happens to be across the street from where I live, and where I live happens to be 3 blocks from Fenwick. So I went to vote on my lunch hour. It took me 15 minutes. 15 minutes, start to finish. And I do the judicial ballot, so it took me longer than most people. The judicial ballot in Illinois, of course, another one of those examples of the voter burden, where people just say, I'm not going to bother with it. You should. You definitely should. So when should you register? Well, it varies about registration. Illinois is a very easy state to vote in, and Cook County is a pretty easy place to vote too. They have same-day registration now. Back when I was an election judge, didn't. The cutoff was about 10 days before the election. I didn't really see a problem with that. But then again, I had a student who voted last year in the last election because there was same-day registration. I forgot to register. Yeah, well, teenager, of course they forgot to register, but was able to register and vote the same day, and turned out to be rather excited about it. So that's one of the things that different states and localities can do. How long in advance do you have to register? Can you register online? Most places are going to that. And that is much more secure than some people think it is, because they are able to check your electronic records with the state and prove that you are who you said you were. Election day, voting on election day. City of Chicago, my elder son, who's also a Fenwick grad, lives in Chicago, and what they've done with early voting is very interesting. And at first I thought, gee, that's a long time for early voting. Nobody needs to have early voting for that long, because the city of Chicago has almost a month of early voting. But the way Bill explained it to me, it started to make sense, because there are a lot of people who live in the city of Chicago and work in the city of Chicago, but they don't work close to where they live. So for Chicagoans like my son, he lives in River North, but he works in an area I guess you'd call West Loop. And so for him, being able to stop off at the Thompson Center, an early voting center, and vote when it's convenient for him on his way to or from work makes a lot more sense than his having to find his precinct on election day and stand in line there. So, election day voting, how big a deal is it? I remember once when I was an election judge, it was a very it was an election that had fairly high turnout. The polling place was Fair Oaks Presbyterian Church. I don't know how many of you know where that is. We had 2 precincts in there. And I can remember at 7:30 when the polls were, or shortly before 7:30 when the polls were about to close, I was often the one who was sent out to tell people that the polls were about to close. Most of the time I was saying that to an empty street. But I did my legal job. The polls are about to close. But there was one time that I had to go to the back of the line of voters who were still standing there and assure people that what the law says is that if you are in line when the polls close, they have to remain open long enough for you to get in and vote, which means an election judge has to come out and find out where the end of that line is, who's the last person who was standing in that line. And we had to do that once. The polls had to stay open past 7:30 because we had a line of people who were waiting to vote. And if a voter is in line when the polls close, they have to be allowed to vote. Yeah, election day voting. It can be a nuisance. These days it's problematical in some places because of a lack of election judges to man the polling stations. What kind of people are likely to be election judges? What would you say? What sort of profession?
Unemployed.
Retired. Most of them are retired. This became a real issue in 2020, and it was still an issue in 2022, because in 2020 and 2022, elderly people were afraid of COVID. And people who had been election judges and would otherwise have been willing to serve as election judges were frightened of being in polling place with a whole bunch of strangers whose COVID status you have no idea, even if everybody had to wear a mask, which of course you did. But some of these folks quit being election judges and haven't come back. So it's hard to staff polling places. Another thing that makes it difficult on election day is that you have to have one Democrat and one Republican judge. Now, I like to describe myself as one of the last, Teresa knows the joke, Paul probably remembers it too. I like to describe myself as one of the last 6 Republicans at Oak Park. And I always had my pick of polling places because they needed Republicans everywhere in Oak Park. And I could always take, I want my precinct. Okay, you can have it. Yeah. But that's an issue too. Finding people to staff polling places, because you have to have a Democrat and a Republican. And you have to have the two of them. They have to be there all day, and they have to check everything to make sure that nobody from one party is in charge of a particular part of the process. I have to say, just parenthetically, I have been watching elections either in the polling place or from home on television for decades, literally. My interest in American elections and political science goes back to my childhood, seriously. And I was flabbergasted in 2020 by how well the poll stood up to the challenges. I was like, this is amazing. You know, how many places there was a recount and it came out exactly the same? How many places in the world would that happen? Not very many. Not very many. And of course, there is, because of what I told you just a little bit ago about how elections are run on the state and local level, there is no way of tampering in one place with an American national election. Because there's no one place all the ballots go. You would have to go not just to 50 different places, but to thousands of different places, because that's where the ballots are. And everywhere nationwide has some form of paper backup. There are 2 states out west, I keep wanting to say Idaho is one of them, where they don't have precincts and polling places on election day. Well, you have precincts because of government divisions, but people don't go and vote at precincts because all of their voting is mail-in and has been for over a decade. Everybody sends a ballot, gets a ballot in the mail and sends it back in for all of the voting in that state and local, every single issue. It's all done by mail-in ballots. All of it. Obviously not the case nationwide, but this gives you some idea. But obviously, again, if anybody wants a recount there, they've got all those paper ballots. You could definitely look at the ballots. It's absolutely amazing. It really is. Measures to increase participation. Why would you want to increase voter participation? Well, as we've learned, Teresa and Paul may remember this, in our democratic theory, there's a term called universal participation, which is one of the really important terms defining political equality. And universal participation in Australia, anybody know what it means? You are automatically registered to vote when you turn 18 in Australia, whether you like it or not. And if you don't vote, you are fined. And the fine is about $200, which gave rise in Australia in the 1980s to something they referred to as donkey voting. And the reason why they called it donkey voting was that the big video game at the time was Donkey Kong. And people who were pissed off about having to follow politics and vote or pay $200 for the privilege of not voting would go into the polling place and write in the names of characters from Donkey Kong. So hence they called it donkey voting in Australia. It's a way of protesting because you don't want to have to vote. But why do they do that? Because of the principle of universal participation and the idea that if it's not universal participation, then it's not really democratic. You can't call yourself a democracy if you don't have enough people voting. In the United States, we use the term universal participation, but we mean something different. What we mean is that everybody who should vote can vote, but we don't make them if they don't want to. I mean, the turnout that astonished people so much in 2020 was only a little over 60% nationwide. And that was huge in the United States for a presidential election. Really huge. And if you think about that, it's a little concerning in terms of democracy, because if that's how many people are making that decision, is it really the people's decision? So, some states, Illinois included, try to increase participation. How can you do that? You make voting easier. There are a number of countries around the world that do some things that we could do here. For example, Election Day is what day? It's Tuesday. Why is it Tuesday? Because. That's why it's Tuesday. Because. We decided once long ago it was going to be Tuesday, and so it's Tuesday. Could we move it to Saturday or Sunday? Yes. Some countries do. And that increases turnout. That increases turnout because people don't have to work. Now, in the United States, it is illegal to keep somebody away from the polls by saying you have to work all day on Election Day. But, of course, if you have early voting, if you have absentee ballots, if you have mail-in ballots, then that's really shouldn't be an issue. I used to think, when I was an election judge, if you were voting absentee, there was a form you had to fill out. You had to go in person to Village Hall and fill out a form, which included asking you the reason why you were not going to be voting on Election Day. And, of course, they checked your identification and everything. You filled out your ballot there. You put it in an envelope. And on Election Day, it came to judges like me in your precinct in an envelope full of other absentee ballots. And after we counted all the ballots that were cast that day, then we got to the absentee ballots and checked the envelopes to make sure they were right, and then we counted those ballots. Early voting is different. It's a lot more convenient. You don't have to tell anybody why you want to vote early. And there's certainly one group of people that I can think of. I once served on I once did jury duty with a plumber. That was the angriest guy. Because he was only getting paid $75 for the day. And he just kept thinking and thinking and thinking about all the work he was missing. For someone like that, early voting is really nice because you can pick a day when you haven't got a lot of jobs or you don't have anything in the morning. You can go and get your voting done, and on Election Day you can be fixing somebody's raging faucet. Voting early can make a difference for a lot of people. It's one way of increasing turnout. Mail-in ballots. We've all heard the discussion about that. Mail-in ballots increases turnout because it's so much easier. And until 2020, Republicans were the people who were most likely to turn in a mail-in ballot. Large percentage of Republican voters use mail-in ballots. Republicans are in general demographically a little older than Democrats, so older people tend to prefer the convenience of turning in a mail-in ballot. Until 2020, Republicans turned in quite a few more mail-in ballots than Democrats did. So there are things you could do. You could change the day. You can give early voting. You can have same-day registration. A lot of other democratic countries do these things. You could require people to register automatically, like Australia does. I'm going to skip what I had down there. It's not particularly important, but I had a couple of questions that I think people need to think about. When does your vote count the most? When does it matter the most? It's so interesting to see the behavior of American voters because most people who don't vote in every election for which they are eligible vote in presidential elections. That's when your vote counts the least. Your vote counts the most in state and local elections, especially local elections, like the one for the swimming pool in Oak Park. That's when your vote really matters the most. You have an awful lot of power if you get out to the polling place on a day like that. When does your vote count more? When would your vote count more, in 2022 or 2024? 2022. 2022, because a lot of people skip those midterm elections. They don't think it matters. You know who's up in a midterm election? Every member of the House of Representatives and 1/3 of the United States Senate are up for re-election every 2 years. Those midterm elections. A lot of people skip them. The time to vote is when everybody else isn't doing it, when you're not hearing a bazillion things about it on television, etc. That's when your vote counts the most. And you can have an awful lot of impact on what's going on in your community. Because remember, there's a lot of tax money, there are a lot of decisions that affect your life and the lives of your family and your business. When I tell the kids they have to attend a meeting of local government, my next question to them is, do you want to see people fight? And of course they say, I say, school board and zoning board. Because people will fight like hell about their kids and their property. And their property. Zoning board meetings are so interesting. And I've had kids who've attended zoning board meetings that, wow, this is really something. They really get into it, especially if they come from a family where somebody owns a small business. If you're talking about a restaurant or a shop or something. Or there's something about housing property. I've had kids from Hinsdale, for example, who've gone to meetings where it was either zoning or the Hinsdale board, and they were talking about things like street lighting and sidewalks. Well, to my students, you get 5 minutes of conversation about that, and they start thinking about trying to walk around Hinsdale and drive around Hinsdale in places where there isn't a lot of street lighting or there aren't any sidewalks, and all of a sudden they understand what the conversation is about. But if you want to have an influence on those things, you got to vote. I once took a bunch of kids to Springfield, and this was when Fenwick alum Pat Quinn was governor. And there was another Fenwick alum who was one of the guys who was working in his office. And I'll never forget what Lou said to me and to my students. He said, "You want to know why Illinois politics is so rotten? I'll tell you why Illinois politics is so rotten." He said, "It's because if you ask somebody on the street, an Illinois voter, who their state rep or state senator is, they can't tell you." And what that means is that the state rep and state senator don't owe the voters a damn thing. They owe everything to their party leaders, who at the time were Mike Madigan and Christine Radonio, who led the Republicans. That's the only people to whom they owe anything. They don't owe anything to the voters. You want to know why they don't pay attention? Because the voters don't pay any attention to them. If you think about how many people do not even know who their state rep and state senator are, by the time I get through with your kids, they know. Because I don't let them not know. And I finally figured out how to do this. Teresa and Paul probably laugh. I don't know why I didn't. Well, I do know why I didn't, because you guys didn't have iPads. But what I do now is, last year I did this, and I had told them for 3 days, find out who your congressman is. And I started going around the room, and there were maybe 2 kids out of 25 who could tell me who their congressman was, and I said, "Get out your iPads. We're going to find out who your congressman is." "Well, how do I find out?" "Put your address in." And we started turning up the congressmen's websites and things. And of course, while they weren't all from the same congressional district, as they would be if it was a public school, There were groups, and they started turning up information. This got interesting, and now I know. Mike Quigley is my congressman. Jan Schakowsky is my congressman. And all of a sudden, this gets quite a bit more real. You can do that with regard to state officials as well. I wonder how many people were concerned about the tuition issue, knew who you were supposed to talk to. Who was your state rep? Who was your state senator? Those were the people that needed the pressure to get that bill through. And by the way, that might still happen again in the next session. They're talking about bringing it up again. So your vote counts the most at those times. That's when you need to pay attention. And the price of not voting is exactly what Lou said it was. Why should they care what you think if you don't vote? Every once in a while, there is a political upheaval in another country where people who are protesting against the system in general decide to boycott an election. This has happened several times in Africa in the last 10 or 15 years, in a few countries, but only a few. Most of the time, if you boycott an election, you've given up your power to do anything about the results. In the United States, election boycotts, I know a lot of U.S. history, and I've never heard of one that succeeded in anything. And the general view of American political scientists, what does low turnout mean? Well, the political system interprets it as acquiescence. You don't vote because you're okay with what's going on. If you ask a lot of people who don't vote why they don't vote, they say they're disgusted with the system. That's not how the system sees it. The system sees a no vote as, I don't have to bother with what you think. That's the power of voting. It's really, really important. It's most important when we think it's least important. There is one group of Americans who vote come hell or high water. You can't stop them from voting. They will do whatever they have to do to get registered, and they will turn up no matter what the weather is like on election day. They are African Americans who are either of a certain age or were raised by people who participated in the civil rights movement. I know something about this. My children grew up next door to a wonderful African American family in Oak Park. And boy, if I forgot that I needed to go vote, I knew it because Gary and Stephanie asked, did you get to the polls today? Because they never missed, no matter how small it was. I remember I was flabbergasted at how small. One of the questions was, it was a very small municipal election. It was in February once, and there was just a couple of Oak Park issues on the ballot. There was nothing national or statewide. Gary and Stephanie were there. They voted. They voted. Because when you know what it means not to be able to, the right to vote can be very, very precious. And they don't take it for granted. So, that's my take on voting. What I am trying to teach the kids is how to understand that this is their government. As long as you get off your butt and vote, it is your government. And if you understand what you're doing, if you inform yourself about the issues, you can make it work for for you. And you should, my students should, when I'm through with them, be able to cast a ballot that is in keeping with the policies they want to see and with their values. And that's what I'm here to do. Thank you for coming. Does anybody have any questions? Yeah.
Is there a test after? If there is, what's the answer? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What happens if you can't hold an election? Like there's an earthquake or hurricane. I think one of the traditional things people occasionally worry about is like it's a presidential election in November, Florida's the swing state, the governor orders an evacuation.
I really don't know. And actually, I guess one of the things we'd have to look at as a precedent for that might very well be some of the things that were done during the pandemic. Because that was, remember what I said about not having enough election judges because people were concerned, and the fact that some states extended the amount of time that you had to apply for a mail-in ballot or turn it in. Remember, that was an issue. Some of the lawsuits are based on the fact that states were accepting ballots later. I think that might be what you would be looking at, that kind of thing. Now, as far as emergencies go, it is worth noting that two of the men who are usually on the lists of the top 5 American presidents held a presidential election during wartime. Abraham Lincoln held the election in 1864. It is one of my favorite stories because one of the documents that was found after Lincoln's death in the White House was an envelope with a series of instructions and ideas that was in a sealed envelope because Lincoln had been fairly sure he was going to lose the election. And these were instructions for those who were going to carry out the government between November and the inauguration, which in those days was in March. Yeah. And Lincoln really believed that he was going to lose in 1864. The Democrats, in some ways, played their cards very, very well. They picked an excellent candidate, George McClellan. McClellan was extremely popular with the troops. And because of the way the war was going, and people were so angry, Mary Lincoln was one of the people who hated Ulysses Grant. And they said Grant was a butcher because he was sending their sons into battle to actually fight and die. McClellan was losing battles because he was unwilling to fight, because what he said was, victory has no charms for me secured at such a price, the price of the deaths of his soldiers. He was very popular. And for people who had had enough of the war by that time and wanted to talk about negotiating an end with the Confederacy, let the Southerners go, etc., it was a great choice. It was a great choice. And Lincoln feared he would lose. And one of the things I think really tells you something very, very important about that was that the margin of Lincoln's victory was the soldiers' vote. The men who were doing the fighting and dying were the ones who put Lincoln back in the White House because they wanted to finish it. And they did not want the deaths of their comrades to have been for nothing. The aims of the war meant something to them. FDR ran again in 1944. Now, whether he should have done that or not, given the state of his health and a whole bunch of other things, the fact that this was already, he was running for a 4th term, you could talk about those other things. But 1944, I think he knew from Lincoln's experience that the nation was not going to cast him aside. And once again, I don't remember whether it was 1940, I think, was when he ran against Wendell Willkie. Wendell Willkie was a guy who would have made a great president. And it's a sad, it's a bittersweet thing that Willkie was also against the triumph of fascism. And he was willing to, he was not an isolationist. The isolationist wing of the Republican Party did not like him very much. Maybe one of the reasons why he didn't win. And after the election, Willkie offered his services to Roosevelt, who was very glad to have him, and was sending him out on some kind of a mission to bolster support for the arsenal of democracy plans for more aid to the Allies. And Willkie died suddenly of a heart attack, and it was Roosevelt's grief at that was very genuine. But yeah, if you look at the fact that two of our greatest presidents conducted an election during a war, I think, and also that because of the way that COVID was handled, we have some more recent precedents about some things you could do in terms of how to run an election. I think it would go ahead. Yeah.
So, brief story. In 08, my son was running the volunteers for Franklin County, which is Columbus, Ohio, where we live.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had the opportunity to be an observer in an inner city neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I arrived about half hour before it opened, the lines were already really long. Inside there were probably about 8 people accepting IDs and telling people they could
Mm-hmm.
vote or whatever. Had no idea what they were doing. And the lines were not moving. And people were getting upset. I remember one woman saying, "I can guarantee you this is not happening in Highland Park," the equivalent of Highland Park.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just total chaos. There was one line for provisional ballots where somebody came in and didn't have the proper ID or whatever the
Mm-hmm.
case may be. They kick people over. Well, that line, everyone was getting pushed over there. I could tell there was one person I figured seemed to be illiterate. You could give him your driver's license, and the guy could not get to that part of the alphabet in the voting book.
Mm-hmm.
So,
It's really important that we have enough people who can do it, who are willing to serve as election judges. And it is a serious concern right now between the passing of the baby boomers, the concerns about COVID, and the attacks, frankly, that we've had on election workers in the last 2 years. It is going to be an issue in this election, whether we're going to be able to have competent election workers. That sounds to me almost like part of what you might be looking at is that the woman who commented about this wouldn't be happening somewhere else is right, that there might have been a political machine involved that was just sending people who were loyal. You don't have to read very well if you're supposed to just.
I was able to call the boiler room where my son was,
Mm-hmm.
and he got the fellow who did the training for that county to come in and get everybody on the same page.
Mm-hmm.
Get the workers trained up on the spot, and everything was running smoothly after that.
That's interesting. That's interesting. Well, then maybe it was just a matter of they didn't know how to start it. They didn't. If you didn't have one experienced election judge to tell everybody else what to do, that would explain it. That would probably explain it. Yeah. I think people don't understand some of the safeguards that are in there that can really bollock things up. For example, there are several. When I used to do it, we used to have several boxes where we put stuff because we used more paper than you do now. But there was only one zip tie to seal it at the end of the day. You could see why there was one zip tie on it when you got it in the morning, and the two of you stood there while somebody clipped it. And at the end of the day, there was only one zip tie to tie the box. So you better be darn sure that everything that needs to be in that box is in the box before you put the zip tie on it, because if it isn't, you're going to have to take it down to headquarters and somebody's going to be in trouble. But the reason for that kind of procedure, of course, is to safeguard the fairness of the vote. It's to make sure that nobody's adding anything extra and that you're both watching when they put it in. Yeah, it's really funny how many things, a lot of people don't realize how many things one election judge cannot do by themselves, because you've got to have somebody from the other party watching while you do that, because they just don't allow that procedure. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
With the importance of voting now, how do you see, or maybe where do you see the gerrymandering issue coming up, where we're seeing certain states where there's almost, in both, I think in Illinois and Wisconsin, where the majorities are almost enshrined by how they draw the districts?
Ohio is the worst, apparently. In Ohio, 38% of the electorate controls 100% of the state legislature, basically. And the Ohio state legislature does stuff that 68% of the people in Ohio disagree with, and they don't care because of the way that they've got the state gerrymandered. It's the most grotesque example of it. There are some political scientists who say that gerrymandering is the biggest threat to American democracy that's out there right now. And in the state of Ohio, it isn't the congressional districts. In terms of the congressional districts, because the courts are looking over their shoulder, they can still have a reasonable distribution, and the distribution in Ohio's more or less, it's a little bit geared to the Republicans. But in the state legislature, they control everything. And just like in Illinois, I'll tell you a funny story. Last year, when I was teaching gerrymandering in AP Gov, my students insisted, when I started talking about gerrymandering, we don't know what that is. I said, well, obviously you didn't read the chapter. But, okay, I will explain. Yes, I will explain. So I started talking about gerrymandering, the famous story about where it came from, Elbridge Gerry and his salamander map. I showed them what districts ought to look like, because you actually can. There is a map that looks like that. It's Iowa. It's Iowa, because decades ago, the Iowa state legislature, and this is perfectly constitutional, and people tried to do this in Illinois. In Iowa, the state legislature voted to turn over the redrawing of districts after the decennial census to a nonpartisan commission. And if you look at the Iowa map, look it up on computer, it's a thing of beauty. They only have 4 congressional districts. But they're all straight lines. And not only that, everybody who lives in a particular county votes in the same congressional district. And all that the commission does every 10 years is just move some of these straight lines around a little bit. Doesn't take very long. The adjustments are fair. You can see that geographically, the congressional district in the southeastern part of the state is smaller because the population is more dense there. In the northwestern part of Iowa, it's a bigger box, but it's still roughly a box. That's what it should look like, and I explain this to the kids. By the way, what happened in Illinois was that there was a proposal brought up, and it was an advisory referendum, if I remember right, from the voters. They wanted to have a nonpartisan commission, but the Illinois State Supreme Court said, well, you can't do that according to the Illinois state constitution. Illinois State Supreme Court, of course, was controlled by the Democrats. So that's one of the reasons why there are some people in the state of Illinois, myself included, who have decided that the only way out of gerrymandering in Illinois is ranked choice voting. And so there's an initiative for that. That's one way to break gerrymandering. But the best way to do it is what Iowa did. So we looked at that, and then I brought up on that whiteboard, the smart board, yeah. I said, on your iPads, if you want to follow along on your iPads, Google, this is the only term you need, Goofy Kicking Donald Duck. If you Google Goofy Kicking Donald Duck, what you will get is the map of a grotesquely gerrymandered single congressional district in Pennsylvania. It was drawn by Republicans in the state legislature. And it really does look like Goofy Kicking Donald Duck. I'm glad to say that the court said, no, you can't do that. I don't know how many elections were held under the Goofy Kicking Donald Duck map, maybe one. But that grotesque gerrymandering. Illinois has had a place in civics textbooks for decades because of the headphone district. The headphone district has one lobe north of some of the suburbs like Oak Park that are just north of the expressway, and another lobe south, and parts of the headphone district are just along a highway. The highway is part of the congressional district. What the headphone district, so it looks like a pair of headphones set on the side, and the district in the middle is the one we're in. It's the 7th district. But the 6th Illinois district is a headphone district, and that was for Luis Gutierrez, and they drew that map so that Luis Gutierrez would have a safe congressional seat. Chuy Garcia is in that seat now, I think, and Luis Gutierrez, last I heard, was trying to figure out how he could become governor of Puerto Rico. But yeah, that was the point of the headphone district. So I showed them the headphone district. I showed them Goofy Kicking Donald Duck. I showed them Iowa. And then I showed them the map of Illinois, the most recent one, if you've seen it. The kids took one look at it and burst out laughing. Some of that laughter was relief because they realized, oh, that's what she's talking about. Now I'm not going to get it wrong on the test. There is a slash across the state of Illinois from Champaign-Urbana in the east through Springfield to East St. Louis. That's a congressional district. And it's only a couple of miles wide, but the idea was so that all those Democrats could vote together and not be subsumed in Republican districts. And of course, that's what happened to Adam Kinzinger. Donald Trump likes to say he got rid of Adam Kinzinger. No, he didn't. Adam Kinzinger was going to fight for his seat. But while he could fight the Republicans, he could not fight the map. He took a look at the map. Where they had drawn him in was with another very strong Republican congressman. And Kinzinger said, there's just no way I can beat him. No way I can beat him. The map completely defeated him. Illinois is really badly gerrymandered. It's very badly gerrymandered. And the gerrymandering isn't all that significant in the Chicago area. It's these other things because the Chicago area is what it is. The city is deep blue and the suburbs are purple. And then some of the suburbs are bright red. I sometimes draw this map on the board for the kids. That basically you got blue in the city, purple in the suburbs, blue spots in Champaign, Springfield, and East St. Louis, and the rest of the state is red. And this, I said, is why the people south of Kankakee hate Chicago so much, because they can't control politics in the state at all because of all the votes that are concentrated in Chicago. All the Democratic votes that are concentrated in Chicago control what happens in Springfield. Illinois is not the only state that looks like that. You could draw the same map in New York, and it goes very much the same way. New York City, deep blue. The suburbs, purple. Albany, blue. Possibly Buffalo, blue, and the rest of the state's red. And there are several other states that work that way too. Yeah. Yes, I think gerrymandering is a very serious problem. We've tried to get rid of it the way Iowa did in Illinois. It failed because of who was on the Illinois State Supreme Court and what the Constitution says in Illinois, the state Constitution. So the only way out in Illinois, as far as I can tell, is ranked choice voting. Neither party likes it, by the way, which suggests that it's probably a good idea. Yeah.
Do you know anything about the mechanics of actually bringing something to a vote within a legislature? I'm going to go back to the Illinois tax credit scholarship thing, which I got to know way more than I ever did. The real frustrating thing about that in the end was, even though it was clearly the hot button issue in Springfield, the entire past 2 years, frankly, but certainly in this most recent veto session of the legislature, even though there were literally dozens and sometimes hundreds of kids and families there in support of extending the legislation, and every day there were opponents there as well, right? In the halls of Springfield was all they were talking about, but it wasn't even brought to a vote. And that was really the frustrating thing where I think those involved. So how is that even possible in a democracy when that's clearly the issue that voters care about? Right? Or if they're not voters, they're at least being represented by...
Well, and see, the other thing about that one, Chris, is that it is represented by the Democrats as their folks don't want the scholarships, and that this is somehow unfair to people of color, when I'm sure what you know is that there are plenty of people of color who do not consider that in any way unfair. They would like to have scholarships. Yes, they would like to have access to that. In fact, there's a substantial amount of support among that community. I think the answer to that question is Chris Welch. And the power that the speaker has. The speaker can decide whether it's even going to get to the floor.
Yeah. Is it that way in every state? Do you know?
Probably.
Yeah, it's just crazy.
Yeah. Yeah, the speaker can decide whether it's going to get to the floor. And, yeah, that particular issue. And of course, the way that gerrymandering has worked out in Illinois recently, with the recent loss of congressional districts because of the census, the Republicans are more outnumbered in the legislature now. That map is a disgrace. The one that made my students laugh when 20 minutes earlier they said they didn't know what gerrymandering was. Oh, now we know what gerrymandering is. Yeah. That map is a real disgrace. And it explains how the speaker has enough power to do that. Mike Madigan probably could have handled it the same way.
Oh, without a doubt.
Yeah.
It was not being a political junkie.
Yeah.
Having been to Springfield until this issue down there, I think 4 times now in the last 2 or 3 years. It was surprising to me, despite clearly this was the issue on people's minds, that it could just be, well, we're not going to bring it to a vote.
Yeah. Well, and I'll tell you something else that puzzles me a little bit about that, because a lot of people on the left say that this kind of tax voucher tuition thing is somehow undemocratic. I belong to Grace Lutheran across the street there, and we helped to sponsor a Lutheran school in Slovakia. in Martin, Slovakia, up in the Velika Tatra Mountains, beautiful community. They have 3 private schools plus the public schools in Martin, a Catholic school, the Lutheran school, and a hockey academy, which is ice hockey. Those boys start at the age of 8 and they go to school and play hockey. That's what they do. When Slovakia got out from under the communist yoke, this is a former communist country now, socialist, it's the way people think. They set up a system where the government spends X amount of dollars, X amount of euros per kid, and the money follows the student. And nobody in Slovakia thinks anything of it. It's just, and it's a former communist country, but nobody thinks anything of it. What one of the parents of one of my students, I taught English to 9-year-old Slovaks for 2 weeks. One of the scariest things I ever did. And the parent of one of my students talked about how awful those communist public schools were. Because the communists, all you had to do was be a party member and you got your job and you didn't actually have to teach and do anything. And they said they didn't care about the kids and they were mean to the kids, and my child didn't learn anything much, and I just love this school because the teachers love the kids and they care if they learn anything, and and like I said, there's a Catholic school in Martin, there's a Lutheran school in Martin, and there's a hockey academy. And a lot of people, and the government will pay to send your kid to the Lutheran school or the Catholic school. That's what you want. That's where the money that comes from the central government, from Bratislava, goes there. And nobody thinks anything of it. And even though Slovakia has just had a major political change, I guarantee you nobody's talking about changing the way the schools are funded. That's just the system there. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here.
Yes, very much. Thank you. Thank you.